It's good to have some of our travelers back with us. We look forward to the rest of them showing up as soon as possible. How does Joshua chapter 21 end? Not one of the good promises which the Lord had made to the house of Israel failed. All came to pass. How much has that changed since then to today? Today's last verse and tomorrow's last verse and the next day's last verse could be, not one of the good promises which the Lord has made to us, to his children, have failed. All has come to pass. So it's as true today as it was that far back. In chapter 22, Joshua is going to summon those 2.5 tribes. Remember the 2 tribes and half of the tribe of Manasseh that wanted their land on the east side of the Jordan. They were allowed to do that on what condition? That they go into the promised land and help their brothers take the land and fight. Then they could go back. And so they set up houses and pens and things for their wives and children and animals back on the east side, but they went armed into the land of Canaan to help their brothers take the land. The fear was that it would be a discouragement to the tribes on the west side in the promised land if their brothers didn't go in there and help them fight. They have done that, and now it's time for them to go take charge of their territory on the east of the Jordan. And notice what Joshua says about those 2.5 tribes. What observation does he make? Verse 3. You have not forsaken your brethren. You have not forsaken your brothers these many days, up to this day. You haven't forsaken your brothers, but you have kept the charge of the commandment of the Lord your God. You've done what God told you to do. You have not forsaken your brothers. And so God has given rest to the ones across the Jordan on the west side. So go back home to the land of your possession. But he gives them an instruction and a caution. Chuck? Right. They left all of their vulnerable things on the east side of the Jordan. Their livestock, their little ones, their wives on the east side of the Jordan. And they did have enough faith that they could go do what God told them to do, and they would be able to go back, and God would keep his promise. No, this was a pretty long stretch for them to conquer that land. And so they did have a lot of faith and demonstrated a lot of faith. Now, this is about the time where you just kind of coast on in, and you said you've been really good, so just kind of coast on in. Doesn't he say coast on in? Oh, man. What does he say? Be very careful to observe the commandment and the law which Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you, to love the Lord your God and walk in all his ways and keep his commandments and hold fast to him and serve him with all your heart and with all your soul. Once again, when do we get to the point where we just kind of coast on in? Doesn't matter what we've done, how good we've been, in quotation marks. We never get to the point where we just coast on in. So he patted him on the back, said, you've done a great job. You haven't been abandoning your brothers. You did what Moses told you to do. Only, but be careful what you do, that you obey God, obey what Moses has told you, God has told you through Moses. You be careful to walk in all his ways, to keep his commandments, to hold fast to him and serve him with all your heart and all your mind. They were not ever in a place where they could just say, well, we just kind of take it easy and it doesn't matter. We can just coast on in. It just explains there in verse 7 that half of the tribe of Manasseh had taken a possession east of the Jordan River, but the other half took their possession on the west side of the Jordan. And so he sent them away to the tents, and he sent this blessing. And he says in verse 8, they're returning with what? Stuff. Lots of stuff. Great riches, livestock, silver, gold, bronze, iron, clothes, all that stuff. And so they were returning home with all of that, all their possessions. But when they get to the Jordan River, before they cross the Jordan to go back on the east side where their possession is, what do? They build a large altar. And that's all it says in verse 10. It doesn't. We find out later on what their motive is, but all it says here is before they cross the Jordan, they build a large altar. When the word gets back to the other tribes, to the rest of Israel, what do? They gather themselves in verse 12 to go to war. They get their armies ready, and they're headed off to fight. Over an altar, though. And we'll understand in a second why they're going to fight over the altar, because they explain to those 2.5 tribes why they're so upset. You don't think this is the way it's going to be forever and always? Chuck knows the Israelites way too well. You read ahead, didn't you? You're not supposed to read ahead. And so the Israelites, especially the priest and the chiefs, and they go across into the land of Gilead, which is on the east side of the Jordan River. And what do they say to them? Why are they upset? Yeah, why have you done this unfaithful act? Building this altar was an unfaithful act. Why is it an unfaithful act? It's in violation of what God has commanded. He did not command them to do this, and they did it anyway. And they weren't supposed to do this, build an altar just on their own whim.
I get that, but the initial response right away is to go to war with them? Is that over the top or not?
Well, no, it's not over the top. It'd be nice if they were always like that they would get so upset because part of their group is disobeying God, and we'll see why in just a second.
One thing that I noticed is they didn't go straight to war. They actually went and talked to them.
Yeah, and that was the good thing, because sometimes they end up going to war and they fight and ask questions later, and that's not a good solution. And so they did send a delegation. It sounds to me as if the army stayed on the west side of the Jordan, and then the one group went across to talk to them. And so you're right. They started out by discussing it, which was very fortunate. And in verse 17, they remind those 2.5 tribes of what? The iniquity of Peor, when they intermingled with the people, the pagans, and how a plague came upon the congregation. In verse 18, we see part of the reason why they are so upset about this, and why is it so critical that they take such immediate, strong action? When they defeated Jericho and went on to Ai, how many people had sinned? How many people suffered the consequence? All of them. And it was a sin against, God said the whole group had sinned against him. That one person had sinned against him, but it was the whole group. And in verse 18, they said, he will be angry with the whole congregation of Israel tomorrow. God will see this disobedience, and he will be angry with the whole congregation of Israel tomorrow. Do you think it doesn't matter what we do as individuals? That it doesn't make any difference? It's not anybody else's business what I do. You know, my life is my business, and it doesn't affect anybody else. Achan's life affected a lot of people. And they're just upset because they think God's going to take action. See, God will not help them take the territory or hold on to the territory if they're sitting in the camp. If they're sitting in the camp, they can forget about occupying that land because it's gone. And the people of Canaan will just take it back over, and God will not lift a finger to help them. And so they, for once in their lives, they are really upset because somebody in their group had not obeyed God. And you know, if what you have on the other side isn't good enough, just come, we'll give you land on this side. In verse 20, they specifically mention Achan. And wrath fell on all the congregation, and that he didn't perish alone, that there were others who died because of his iniquity. And so that's the situation, that's the response. The 2.5 tribes build an altar and then go on across the river. The Israelites hear about it. They take their army to the river, send a delegation across to talk to them and explain, why have you done this? We're all going to suffer as a result of it. And then beginning in verse 21, there is the explanation given by the 2.5 tribes. You can tell by their language in verse 22 that they're a little bit excited about this, because what do they say? The mighty one, God, the Lord, the mighty one, God, the Lord, exclamation point. He knows what we're doing, and let all of you know, if it was in rebellion to him, he'll take care of it. Let him take care of it. That's pretty good advice. If God's that upset about it, then let him take care of it. You remember when Gideon tore down the Asherah and those pillars, and the people came and said he has to die, and what did Gideon's father say? Baal's a big boy. If he doesn't like it, he can take care of it. And so that was his reasoning, let Baal take care of it. In this case, 2.5 tribes take it on themselves, and they say, if we've sinned against God, let him settle it. Let him take care of it. If we built it to make burnt offerings, or grain offerings, or sacrifices, or peace offerings, let him take care of it. And then they explain in verse 24 why they have really done that. Why did they build that altar? They were worried. They were concerned because the day would come when their descendants would want to go back across the river to worship with the people on that side of the river, and the people in the promised land would say, you're not one of us. You do not belong over here. You're not part of our group. You can't come worship. Isn't it great to have that kind of concern, that your children and grandchildren will be allowed to go back and worship the way God wanted them to worship? And it was of critical importance to them.
Here I am trying to connect it to today. I like the way that they went to them first, find out what's going on, instead of jumping to conclusions too fast. And talking to them, finding out what the situation is, assessing them, finding out, hey, this isn't really a bad situation. This is an important remembrance.
Yeah.
So sometimes as us, we can jump to conclusions sometimes. I know I'm guilty of that. So I've got to learn to slow down.
You're at the bottom part of our page.
I'm sorry.
With very good thoughts. You are way ahead. Your thoughts are excellent. The best possible thoughts. And so the explanation is that it's a witness. And how many times have we seen a pile of stones, or like when they crossed the Jordan River, they took 12 stones and they set it up as a witness so that children will ask, what are these? Or different times they've set up a pillar just as a memorial. And that's all this is. It's just a reminder that they're part of the same group. Well, God told the Israelites to build the altar that they had to build, but he did not command them to build this altar. And it would have been a strange altar to build an altar that God had not authorized. And it's good that they both cared that much about it. The 2.5 tribes had no intention of offering a sacrifice. They knew it was wrong. And it upset the others so much that they were willing to fight. But if you, and then they went on and accepted that the other tribes accepted it, but they explained why and what they did, and it says it pleased them. And in verse 31, now instead of starting a war, what is the response of the tribes from west of the Jordan? Now we know God is in our midst. We know God is among us because of your answer, because of your attitude, because you did not commit an unfaithful act, and you've stopped punishment, the whole of Israel being punished by God. And they give a name to that altar, and what do they call that altar? They call it witness. They just give it a name and call it witness, and that's the name of that altar. Now, if you look down at the bottom of your sheet, did the 2.5 tribes do anything wrong by building an altar? Well, no, it wasn't commanded by God, but they weren't actually building an altar, because they weren't building something to offer sacrifices on. They were building a memorial. They're building a reminder. Still, regardless of their intentions, what almost happened? And although they did send a delegation, Israel did take their army right to the riverbank. And so, regardless of their best intentions, there was almost a big war. How could it have been avoided? Well, the altar itself isn't a bad thing, because they want to be sure that they have a chance to go back home, or that to worship on that side. Yeah, how about if they would have communicated beforehand? Hey, we're headed back home, but we want to make sure that everybody remembers that we're part of you, so when we go, we're going to build an altar. It's not to offer sacrifices. It's just a reminder. That's why we're going to do it, and then we're going to go on home. That would have gone a long way to avoiding mounting a whole army and marching to the Jordan River, if they would have explained it. Are there ever any problems in the church when someone does something that's not wrong, but someone else takes it the wrong way? Does that ever happen, that someone does something that's not wrong, but someone takes it the wrong way? Well, how can we avoid those problems in the church? Communication? Yeah, a little bit of communication. Explaining. Sometimes we don't know. We can't anticipate everything we're going to do and the impact it has on other people. But one way or another, either the person doing something, communicating, or, as Don was pointing out, the person on the other end of it communicating and saying, hey, this is what I see. Is this really what's going on? And so communication goes a long way both directions. And they weren't very far from having a big war. I mean, they just got through fighting together to conquer this whole land, and 2.5 tribes are going back home peacefully, and just almost as soon as they get across the Jordan, here's a potential war. And I'm afraid that happens all too often in the church, that no matter how peacefully we're living, something happens and can blow up out of proportion if it's not communicated. And so, Don is right. This is something we need to see how it applies to us today, not just something that happened to these people back then, because the same principles are true today, that there's a potential there if we don't communicate. In chapter 23, now they've all settled down, and God has given rest to them on every side. If you go back to Joshua 13 for a second. Joshua 13 begins saying, Now Joshua was old and advanced in years when the Lord said to him, You are old and advanced in years. And so it says when Joshua was old and advanced in years, God told him, Hey, you're old and advanced in years. Yeah, you're only as old as you feel, yeah. He might have said that to Caleb, but I don't know. I'm not sure about Joshua. Chapter 23 begins that Joshua, it says that Joshua was old, advanced in years, and Joshua calls the people, and what does he say to them in verse 2? Now he's the one that says it. Before God said it, God said, You're old. And now Joshua says, I'm old. I'm old and advanced in years. I thought it was just kind of funny that God told him the first time. Now he's saying it. And you've seen everything that God has done because he's the one who's been fighting for you. You've divided the land. And God will continue to drive them out if you obey him. But in verse 6, what's his warning? Be very firm to do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, so that you may not turn aside from it to the right hand or to the left. You know, there are some who suggest that what we have in the Bible was passed down by oral tradition for generations and generations and generations, and then finally written down, probably changed quite a bit over the years. This says obey the words of the book of Moses. They already have the law and some other things written down that they're to obey the written part. And what are they not to do? Do not associate with those nations. Do not mention the name of their gods. Do not make anybody swear by their gods. Do not serve their gods. Do not bow down to their gods. But what are they to do? Cling to the Lord your God as you have done to this day. What does cling mean? Hold fast. Yeah. Just like plastic wrap. The kind that sticks to everything, not the kind that sticks to nothing. Cling to God as you have done to this day. What has God done for them? He has driven out great and strong nations in front of them. No one has been able to stand before him as long as they were being obedient. How many of them did it take to drive out 1,000? One of your men puts to flight 1,000. Why? Because God is the one who fights for you as he promised. So again in verse 11, do what? Take diligent heed to yourself to love the Lord your God. If you ever go back and stop clinging to him and cling to those nations around you and intermarry with them and associate with them and they with you, know for certain what? God will not drive them out. There will be a snare and a trap, a whip on your sides, ouch, thorns in your eyes, until you perish from off this good land which the Lord your God has given you. If you continue to obey God, he will continue to drive out your enemies. If you do not, you either cling to him or you cling to them. What's the third option? There's no third option?
But it's interesting that they will suffer in this life if they do not obey God.
Yeah, they will suffer pretty immediately if they disobey God and don't follow him. But as is always the case, there's no third option. You know, when Jesus talks about a wide road and a narrow road, there's not a third middle of the road there somewhere. You're either on one or the other, but there's no middle of the road. There's no somewhere between clinging to God. I'm not really clinging to God, but I'm not really clinging to the nations. I'm just kind of neutral in the middle. That's not an option. You either cling to God or you don't. What's going to happen to Joshua? What's his future? I am going the way of all the earth. And you know in all your hearts and all your souls that not one word of all the good words which the Lord your God spoke concerning you has failed. All have been fulfilled for you, not one of them has failed. And so once again, it's pointed out that how faithful has God been at keeping his promises. Total, complete, not one thing has failed. But if you don't follow him in verse 15, he will either keep his promises or his threats. And if you don't cling to him to receive the promises, he will bring upon you all the threats until he has destroyed you from this good land that he has given you. And when you do this, you disobey God and serve other gods and bow down to them, God will burn, his anger will burn against you, and you will perish quickly from off the good land which he has given you. So,
An interesting choice of words here, because he says when, not if.
yeah.
And so I mean, it's not. He knows it's going to happen.
Yeah, I think you're right. I noticed that too. He could say when as if you ever, when you ever, but I think he probably knows better because of things he says in the next chapter. And I think he realizes that it's not a question of if, it's a question of when they're going to do that.
Josh was old enough to have witnessed a lot of their complaining and doubting and disobedience.
How many adults alive at this time Joshua was speaking knows exactly how they were through the whole wilderness and for 40 years in the wilderness? How many living adults are there? Like a couple of them? Joshua and Caleb? Yeah, maybe the priest. But he knows who they are. And he has seen them through all of that. And he knows them. He's still optimistic. He says, now if you do this, it's going to turn out this way. And I think he's optimistic that it's going to go that way. Now, in chapter 24, he calls everybody together, all the people to Shechem. I think Shechem is where they've pitched the tabernacle. I think it's where Eli and Samuel and so forth are at Shechem. And so it's a gathering place for them. I believe that's right. And they all presented themselves before God. He gives them a history lesson, and what does he say? First, he speaks for God. He speaks in God's voice, beginning in verse 2. That says, the Lord, the God of Israel. And what does he say? A long, long, long time ago, your forefathers lived beyond the river in Ur of the Chaldeans, namely Terah, Abraham's father, and the father of Nahor. And when they were there, what gods did they serve? Your forefathers, when they lived across the Euphrates, served other gods. And so God says, then I took your father Abraham and took him to Canaan and multiplied his descendants and gave him Isaac. And it's to Isaac, Jacob, and Esau. And to Esau he gave the land of Edom, Mount Seir. To Jacob they went down to Egypt, and then God sent Moses and Aaron and sent the plagues to bring them out. And he gives them a history lesson. The blessings and the curse, yeah. 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 And it is a good central location. And Ebal, Mount Ebal and Gerizim are the two mountains where they pronounced half of them pronounced a blessing from one, and the others pronounced the curses from the other. And that's fitting with what Joshua is doing here because he's summarizing the blessings and the curses. God mentions Balaam, Balak, who hired Balaam. And in verse 10, we see who was really in control of that. If you just read the initial story, it sounds a little bit like maybe Balaam was really a good guy and he decided not to curse Israel. And, you know, but in verse 10 of Joshua 24, what does it say? I was not willing to listen to him, so he had to bless you. He had no choice. They went to Jericho and fought against them, and then all the different tribes that they defeated. God sent the hornet before them. And the last little part of verse 12 is a very important phrase to remember. All these things happened. You drove out your enemies, but not by your sword or your bow. And that's another thing we can remind ourselves of every day.
It's not on our strength that we get through.
Whatever I do, when you get up in the morning, it's going to be a wonderful day. It's going to be an awesome day. I'm going to accomplish great things, but not by my sword or my bow, but by God's power. It's going to be a great day. At the end of the day, you can look back at the day and say, well, this was a wonderful day. This was an awesome day, but not by my own power, but by the awesome power of God. Now, you remember the ultimate blessing and the ultimate curse in the Old Testament? The ultimate blessing is you will live in houses you did not build. You will pick fruit from trees and vineyards that you did not plant. What is the ultimate curse? You will build houses and not live in them. You would plant trees and vineyards but not eat any of the fruit. And so that was the blessing or curse back then, was you'll either go to a lot of work and somebody else is going to benefit from it, or you're going to go in and benefit from the work somebody else did. And in verse 13, we see which awaits the Israelites, or what has happened to the Israelites. I have given you a land on which you had not labored, cities you had not built, and you have lived in them, and you're eating of vineyards and olive yards which you did not plant. God is giving them the ultimate blessing. This is their ultimate blessing, that you get all of these things because I gave it to you, and you did not work for any of it. I delivered it into your hands. Now therefore do what? Fear God, revere God, reverence God, and serve Him in sincerity and truth. This is God. Yeah, this is Joshua through verse 13, and the quotation closes at the end of 13, and Joshua begins in verse 14. So this is now Joshua speaking. When Jesus met the woman at the well and they were discussing where they should worship, this mountain or that mountain, he said that God is spirit, and those who worship Him must worship in spirit and in truth. And here Joshua says that you need to fear God and serve Him in sincerity and in truth. Isn't that the same thing? With the right attitude, the right spirit, and in the right way. How about a 50-50 deal? How about if I have the right attitude, the right spirit? I may not do everything quite right, but hey, my heart is good. How about the other side of the coin? I'm going to do everything exactly what it says. I really don't care much about it, and I'm really not, too excited about it, but I'm going to do what it says. How about that? If we worship God, we're going to worship Him the right way with the right attitude. And if we don't, then half doesn't cut it. Half is not okay. And that's what He says that they need to do for God. They need to serve Him in sincerity and truth, and put away the gods that their fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve God. Put away the gods that Terah served back in Ur. Really? They still have those with them? No. They didn't bring gods with them from Egypt, did they? No way. What's that? Yeah, they're hoarders. In Amos chapter 5. In Amos chapter 5, beginning in verse 21, God says, I hate, I reject your festivals, nor do I delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer up to me burnt offerings and your grain offerings, I will not accept them. I will not even look at the peace offering of your fatlings. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not even listen to the sound of your harps. But let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Did you present me with sacrifices and grain offering in the wilderness for 40 years, O house of Israel? You also carried along Sekuth, your king, or your lord, your master, your Moloch, and Kenyon, your images, the star of your gods, which you made for yourselves. And God said, all that time, you weren't offering sacrifices to me. You took all those other gods with you. And he says, therefore I will make you go into exile beyond Damascus, says the Lord, whose name is the God of hosts. In Acts chapter 7, Stephen is giving his accusers a history lesson. In talking about Moses in Acts 7:39, our fathers were unwilling to be obedient to him, but repudiated him in their hearts and turned back to Egypt, saying to Aaron, make for us gods who will go before us, for this Moses who led us out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what happened to him. While Moses is up on the mountain getting the 10 Commandments, this is what the people did. And at that time they made a calf and brought a sacrifice to the idol, and were rejoicing in the works of their hands. But God turned away and delivered them up to serve the host of heaven, as it is written in the book of the prophets. It was not to me that you offered victims and sacrifices 40 years in the wilderness, was it, O house of Israel? You also took along the tabernacle of Moloch and the star of the god Rompha, the images which you made to worship them. I will also remove you beyond Babylon. They weren't fooling God. They weren't tricking God. You remember after the Israelites were taken into captivity, the northern tribes were taken into captivity, the Assyrians moved people from other places, and they tried to mix their worship with worship of God, Jehovah. How did that work? Later, after they came back out of captivity and they were rebuilding Jerusalem, rebuilding the temple, the people of the land came to them, the ones that were trying to stop their progress, and said, we, like you, serve God. We serve the same God. And the people who were rebuilding the temple said, no, you do not. You have no part or portion with us. You are not worshiping the same God we are. And sadly, that's an ongoing theme, that people think they're serving God if they're compromising. God is a jealous God. He does not share his position with anybody or anything else. He is not just number one, he is the only one. So back in Joshua 24, Joshua points out, you need to put away those gods that you had beyond the river and in Egypt and serve God. They're still carrying them around. And then in verse 15, that famous line of his speech, what does he say? If it is disagreeable in your sight to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves today whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served which were beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Joshua was the head of his household, and he spoke for the whole house. He said, you choose what you want to do. You make your choice. I can't make your choice for you. You make your choice. But I'm going to tell you what we're going to do. If people in the congregation decide to not follow God so closely, and one by one they turn away from obeying God. And the last person out that door to turn out the light, who is that going to be? Each one of us better say it's going to be me. If there's one person left standing, faithful to God, you choose what you're going to choose, but I am going to serve God. And if every one of us in here says that, that's a good thing, because there'll be a whole group of us saying, as for us and our houses, we will serve the Lord. And so we just need to make sure that we're the last man or woman standing. And that's basically what Joshua is saying. You go ahead and keep following those gods if you want to, but there's going to be one family faithful to God, no matter what. And the people say, oh, we're going to be so good. Far be it from us. Did somebody say? And the people say, amen. No. And the people said, oh, far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord and serve other gods. He's the God who brought our fathers out of Egypt from bondage. And he did all these great things, and he preserved us all this way. And God has driven out all of our enemies. We also will serve the Lord, for he is our God. You're going to serve God. We're going to serve God. We're all going to serve God. And Joshua says, no, you won't. Joshua says, you are not able to serve God. You will not be able to serve God because he is a holy God. He is a jealous God, and he will not forgive your transgressions or your sins.
Well, and the problem on our end is the soil of our hearts, the
Yeah.
ways of the world, the love of riches and things that we can't because we allow other things to get in the way.
That's exactly right. How much room does God want to share in our heart with other things?
Everything.
No matter what it is, how much room does God want to share in our hearts and minds with other things? He's not a sharer. He doesn't have to be a sharer. He shouldn't be a sharer because he is who he is. And he is a jealous God. He is a holy God. And he will not put up with inferior devotion.
You know, Joshua can say this because, he and his house serve the Lord, and God has revealed this. I'm sure God has revealed this to him, So that's why he can say this with conviction.
Yeah.
No, you won't. Because God has revealed this to him. That they won't do it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think he's...
But then, he's seen how they've done it, how they've been in the past,
And he knows that they're still carrying those gods around with them. They may say they're following Jehovah entirely, but they still have those gods with them. These are the same gods that Terah had way back then on the other side of the Euphrates. These are the same gods that they had in Egypt. They still have them. What should they have done with them? Dumped them, gotten rid of them, burned them, thrown them in the river, left them in Egypt, not had them in the first place. But he knows they still have them. And they think that God will share with them, that they can do both. And
People who think they're doing both don't even know that they aren't.
no, people think they've convinced themselves that that's okay, and they don't even realize what they're doing. That God wants our whole heart. And in verse 20 he says, if you forsake God and serve those foreign gods, then God will consume you. You look at all the good stuff God has done, just take it and do the opposite. Just take the opposite of the good, and that's what's going to happen to you. And all the people said, oh no, we will serve the Lord. We're Lord's servers. Joshua said, okay, you're witnesses against yourselves that you have chosen for yourselves the Lord. And they said, we're witnesses. 3 times. First of all, they say, far be it from us, and we will serve God. And he says, no, you won't. And they say, no, we will serve the Lord. And he says, you're a witness. And they said, yes, we are witnesses. 3 times. 2 times that first time, and then 2 more times. They said, yes, we promise. We promise, we promise, we promise. They're witnesses. And so in verse 23, Joshua says, okay, then get rid of those gods. And in verse 24, they said, we will obey God. Did they get rid of the idols? They didn't get rid of the idols. He said, if you're going to follow God, get rid of the idols. And they said, we will serve God. They didn't exactly say they'd get rid of the idols. They said, we will serve God and obey his voice. And Joshua made a covenant with them. And he wrote this all down in a book. And here's another stone. He took a stone and set it up. And what did he say? Behold, this stone shall be a witness. Here's another witness. This stone is going to be a witness. Everything, this stone has heard what God has said. This stone has heard everything that God said. And it's going to be a witness against you if you deny God. And then Joshua dismissed the people, each to his inheritance. And everybody lived happily ever after. We'll get into that in the book of Judges. How old was Joshua when he went the way of the world? He was 110 years old. He had seen a lot. He had been in Egypt as a slave, because if he was 40, later on, at least Caleb was 40, he's seen a lot of things. From slavery in Egypt to Mount Sinai. He was partway up the Mount Sinai when Moses was up there. He had that discussion with Moses about what was going on down there. When Moses would leave the tabernacle, he would stay behind. He was a general of their armies. He led them across the Jordan River into the Promised Land. He's had an amazing life. And they bury him in the land of his inheritance. In verse 31, Israel served God all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who were living then who survived Joshua. And so everybody who was ahead of the Israelites at the time he died, they continued to follow God while they were alive, the ones that knew what God had done. There was one more piece of unfinished business. And what was that? They buried the bones of Joseph. Way back, Moses made his family make a promise. In the very last chapter of Genesis, Genesis 50, in verse 25, Genesis 50:25, what does Joseph make the Israelites promise? If you happen to go back over there someday, then take my bones with you, right? There's no if here. When? When you go, take my bones with you. What does that mean? Did he have any doubt in his mind that they would be going back? He didn't know when it was going to be, but he said, when you go back to the land of Canaan that he promised to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and his descendants, when you go back, do what?
Carry my bones up.
Take my bones with you. And that's what they did.
Those bones all these years.
Yep, all those years, the hundreds of years in slavery, 40 years in the wilderness,
They never lost them.
they didn't lose them.
They lost them all, but they didn't.
Yeah, but they didn't lose it. And they buried his bones in the land that Jacob had bought. Remember the story that preceded the story of Dinah? The interaction with Shechem and the people there. Jacob had pitched a tent, and he bought that land where he had pitched a tent. And they took the bones of Joseph back there and buried him there. And then the priest died, Eleazar, and so forth. And I wish I could say that they lived happily ever after and they did what they promised and they did not disobey God, they didn't turn away from God. But that's the whole story of the book of Judges. And so, if you're tempted to read ahead a little bit, I guess it's okay. And next time, Lord willing, we'll do first part of Judges. What is it, the first 3 chapters? Is that right? Anybody have the sheet? First 3 chapters of Judges. Thank you very much.